She walked into the house at 4 a.m., her high heels dangling from her fingers, her breath reeking of alcohol. I sat on the chair, the light from the lamp casting shadows that heightened the tension in the silent room. She didn't even notice me sitting there until she turned toward the hallway. And that's when I saw it. A bright red Hickey on her neck. Unmistakable. It felt like my heart was being crushed, my breaths growing heavier. "Had a good night?" I said, my voice cold and sharp. She froze, her eyes widening, avoiding my gaze. "Oh, you're still up?" she stammered, trying to sound casual. But when I asked about the mark on her neck, she let out a nervous laugh. "It's nothing, just a drunk friend being silly." That pathetic excuse made everything clear. This wasn't the woman I once loved. In that moment, I knew I had to leave. No arguments, no dramatic confrontation, just a clean break from a life built on lies. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future tales. Let's get started. What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst possible way? It's a question that seems distant, hypothetical, until the moment it's not. Trust is a fragile thing, built carefully over years, yet capable of shattering in an instant. For him, marriage had always been a sanctuary, a promise made with starry eyes and a hopeful heart. But life has a way of testing even the strongest vows, and his was no exception. 7 years ago, their wedding had been the kind of day people dream about. Friends and family gathered in a sunlit garden to witness their vows. He had looked at Lisa, radiant and full of life, and felt a certainty that he had found his forever. She was the kind of woman who could command a room with a smile, her effortless charm and quick wit drawing people in like moths to a flame. He often felt lucky, blessed even, that someone like her had chosen him. Together, they built a life that, on the surface, seemed idyllic. But beneath the veneer of their happy union, cracks began to form. At first, they were easy to ignore. An occasional late night at work, a missed dinner, a text she brushed off as unimportant. "It's just work," she'd say with a reassuring smile. And because he loved her, because he trusted her, he believed her. Trust is believing the person you love, even when doubt creeps in. But trust, he would later learn, can also be a weapon. The subtle shifts in Lisa's behavior grew over time. Her laugh, once warm and genuine, began to feel distant. The way she carried herself around him seemed off, as though she was present in body but not in spirit. On some days, he found himself wondering if it was all in his head. Was he overthinking? Was this just what happened in marriage after the initial spark dimmed? These questions gnawed at him, but he dismissed them as insecurities, unwilling to confront the possibility of something darker. At the time, there were only a handful of female physicians, a large percentage of which were male. Looking back, he wished he had seen the red flags for what they were. The late nights, the rushed explanations, the way her phone never seemed to leave her hand. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. But denial is a powerful thing. After all, it's easier to believe in love than to face the possibility that the foundation of your life might be crumbling beneath your feet. The quiet of New Year's Eve was broken only by the faint hum of the television and the occasional pop of distant fireworks. Edward sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the glow from the screen reflecting off his empty glass. Lisa had left hours earlier, dressed in a shimmering gown that hugged her figure, a bold, dazzling choice that Edward couldn't remember the last time she'd worn, especially not for him. "It's a work thing," she had said casually, her excitement palpable. "Don't wait up." She had kissed his cheek lightly, her perfume lingering longer than her touch. The door closed behind her with an echo that seemed louder than it should have been. He stared at the door, unease creeping in. As midnight passed and the fireworks celebrated a new year, Edward couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't jealousy. It was the hollowness of being left behind in a marriage that had become unfamiliar. At nearly 4 a.m., the sound of the front door jolted him awake. Lisa stumbled in, her heels dangling from her fingers, the sharp scent of alcohol preceding her. He watched silently as she crossed the room, the moonlight revealing the red, unmistakable mark on her neck. "A Hickey." "What's that on your neck?" Edward asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Lisa froze, her hand instinctively flying to her neck. "Oh, this?" she laughed nervously. "Just a drunk friend being silly." "Yes." Her flippant tone made his chest tighten. A mix of disbelief and heartbreak washed over him. She didn't even bother to lie convincingly. Something inside Edward cracked. He knew then. The marriage he'd held on to so tightly was gone. Days later, the weight of his suspicions lingered. Distracted and emotionally drained, Edward found himself driving aimlessly one evening, his mind a storm of anger and confusion. It happened in an instant. A sharp turn he didn't see, the blinding headlights of an oncoming car, the screech of tires, and then darkness. Edward awoke in a sterile hospital room, the beeping of monitors pulling him back to consciousness. Pain shot through his body as he tried to move, his ribs protesting every breath. The fog of confusion cleared, replaced by a painful clarity. His life was unraveling in every possible way. In the midst of this haze, a voice broke through. "Mr. Taylor, you're awake. Can you hear me?" Maria stood at his bedside, her posture straight, her expression calm but alert. She was efficient, her movements precise as she checked his vitals. Her dark hair was pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail, and her uniform was pristine. She didn't smile, but there was a steadiness to her presence that made Edward feel oddly grounded. Maria was not the kind of person to coddle her patients. In her world, every person was equal, no exceptions, no special treatment. Her professionalism was a wall she rarely let down, and Edward was no exception. She spoke to him matter-of-factly, her tone neither warm nor cold, as though her only priority was ensuring he healed and moved on. She had built her career on the belief that empathy didn't have to mean indulgence. To her, kindness was efficiency, and respect was treating everyone with the same dignity. She didn't ask Edward about how he felt emotionally, nor did she pry into the sadness she must have seen in his eyes. She focused instead on his recovery, explaining his injuries and next steps with clinical precision. This no-nonsense attitude struck Edward. He was used to people navigating around his emotions, but Maria didn't seem interested in softening the truth. She handed him painkillers and outlined his physiotherapy plan without sugarcoating the challenges ahead. It was refreshing, albeit startling. Edward found himself oddly drawn to Maria's cold efficiency. In her steady voice and unwavering demeanor, he saw a stark contrast to Lisa's performative charm. Maria was grounded, focused, and uninterested in the theatrics of emotion. "How long until I can walk without this cast?" Edward asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Maria raised an eyebrow, unbothered by his impatience. "That depends on you. If you're committed to the exercises, maybe 6 weeks. If you're not, longer. Your call." Her bluntness caught him off guard, but it also intrigued him. "You don't sugarcoat things, do you?" he said with a faint smile. She nodded. "I don't see the point," Maria replied simply, moving to adjust the IV drip. "The truth doesn't change, no matter how you dress it up." Edward nodded, her words resonating more than he expected. In her no-frills approach, he found something he hadn't realized he was craving. Honesty. Maria's indifference to his personal struggles was oddly liberating. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was standing on solid ground, even if it was painful. As Maria left the room, Edward watched her go, the echo of her steady footsteps lingering. For reasons he couldn't yet name, he found himself wondering about the life of the woman who spoke with such unwavering certainty. Something about her stirred him. Not warmth, but curiosity, and perhaps a small spark of hope. Edward sat in the quiet of his home, the shadows of the night reflecting the emptiness he felt inside. The mark on Lisa's neck had been the final blow, but what followed cemented his resolve. Her dismissive behavior, the late nights she excused as work, and the constant buzzing of her phone had painted a picture he could no longer ignore. One evening, while Lisa was in the shower, he unlocked her phone, a simple passcode she hadn't changed. What he found shattered any lingering doubts. Flirty texts with a coworker named Matt, filled with winking emojis and inside jokes. One message was particularly damning. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." Edward's hands trembled as he took screenshots, emailing them to himself for safekeeping. There was no rage, only a cold clarity. The marriage was over, and there was no room for confrontation, only escape. Right. The next morning, he opened a new bank account, transferring most of the joint funds while leaving enough to avoid suspicion. He secured his personal documents and began discreetly moving his belongings into a storage unit. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, a life that had been overshadowed by Lisa's lies. In the weeks after his departure, Edward found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. At first, there was anger, raw and consuming. But as days turned into weeks, that anger began to shift. The bitterness ebbed, replaced by a strange, quiet relief. Physiotherapy sessions for his injuries became a metaphor for his emotional recovery. Each stretch, each step reminded him that healing wasn't immediate. It required patience and effort. Maria was often there, her steady presence a reminder of resilience. One evening, as they walked through the hospital corridor for his therapy, she spoke. "You're making progress," she said, her tone matter-of-fact but laced with subtle encouragement. "Physically, maybe," Edward replied, "the rest not so much." Maria glanced at him, her dark eyes steady. "It takes time," she said simply, "but you'll get there." Her confidence in him, understated but genuine, sparked something Edward hadn't felt in months. Hope. The connection between Edward and Maria deepened in small, unspoken ways. It wasn't just her professionalism, it was her quiet strength and the way she treated him not as a broken man, but as someone capable of standing on his own. One day, as his sessions neared their end, he found himself asking, "Maria, do you ever let your patients take you out for coffee?" She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That depends. Are you asking as a patient or as Edward?" He smiled for the first time in weeks. As Edward. Their first date was simple, a quiet cafe near the hospital. Maria wore a soft navy dress, her usual no-nonsense demeanor softened by a faint smile. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Edward shared stories of his childhood, his love for woodworking, and even his dreams of traveling. Maria, in turn, spoke about her passion for medicine and her journey of working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. At one point, their hands brushed across the table. Maria didn't pull away, and neither did Edward. Her dark eyes held his, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of warmth, something fragile but real. As their relationship grew, Edward began to see Maria in a new light. She wasn't just strong, she was deeply driven, her life defined by a quiet determination. She spoke of her dream to one day open a free clinic for underprivileged families, her voice steady with conviction. "Why a clinic?" Edward asked one evening as they walked by the river. Maria paused, looking out at the water. "Because everyone deserves care, no matter their circumstances. I've seen too many people fall through the cracks. If I can make even a small difference, it'll be worth it." Edward was struck by her selflessness. Lisa had always craved attention, the spotlight. Maria, on the other hand, worked tirelessly without expecting recognition. "I admire you," he said quietly. Maria glanced at him, her expression softening. "You're stronger than you think, Edward. Don't sell yourself short." In that moment, Edward realized something profound. Maria wasn't just helping him heal, she was inspiring him to dream again. Edward could still remember the warmth of the sun on their wedding day, the way Lisa's laughter seemed to echo through the garden as friends and family gathered around. In that moment, she had been everything he'd ever dreamed of, radiant, confident, and full of life. Their vows felt unbreakable, a promise they'd carry through every trial and triumph. The early years of their marriage were idyllic. Weekends spent exploring the countryside, late-night conversations about dreams and ambitions, and shared dinners where laughter flowed as easily as the wine. Edward worked tirelessly to build a stable home, and Lisa matched his energy with charm and determination. Their life was simple but fulfilling, and for a time, he truly believed nothing could shake the foundation they had built together. But as time passed, cracks began to show. Small arguments turned into long silences, and shared dreams gave way to individual pursuits. Yet, Edward held on, believing that love and effort could weather any storm. When Annie was born, it felt like the reset button on their marriage. Holding his newborn daughter for the first time, Edward felt a love so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Annie became the center of their world, her laughter filling the house with a joy that had been missing for so long. Lisa, too, seemed different in those early months, attentive, nurturing, and deeply invested in their growing family. But as Annie grew older, the demands of parenting revealed new tensions. Lisa began to withdraw, claiming the strain of balancing work and motherhood was overwhelming. Edward, on the other hand, found solace in Annie's innocence, her presence a reminder of the goodness still in his life. Despite the challenges, Edward loved being a father. He cherished the little moments, reading bedtime stories, teaching Annie to ride a bike, and watching her discover the world with wide-eyed wonder. For a brief time, Edward had everything he'd ever wanted. The sight of Annie's tiny hand gripping his finger, the sound of her giggles as Maria, now a part of their life, gently teased her, filled him with a contentment he hadn't thought possible. Maria's presence added a layer of stability and warmth that had been missing for years. Her gentle strength balanced Edward's cautious optimism, creating a harmony in their home that brought him peace. Even amidst life's complexities, Edward felt a quiet, unwavering happiness, a love rooted not in grand gestures but in the small, everyday moments that defined their family. It was a happiness he hadn't known he was capable of finding again. Life for Edward and Maria had settled into a comfortable routine, until it didn't. Over time, Maria's hours at the hospital began to stretch longer and longer. What had started as occasional overtime turned into near constant absence. Edward knew how dedicated she was to her work. It was one of the things he admired most about her, but admiration began to waver under the weight of her absence. Some evenings, Edward found himself alone at the dinner table, his plate growing cold as he waited for Maria to walk through the door. She'd often arrive late, exhausted, and apologize in passing before retreating to the bedroom. "It's the hospital," she explained one night. "We're understaffed, and I can't just leave when people need me." Edward nodded, trying to understand, but the loneliness lingered. It wasn't just about missing dinners. It was about the growing distance between them. The warmth they'd shared was dimming, and Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Maria was slipping away. Then came David. A new doctor at Maria's hospital, he was charismatic, quick-witted, and, according to Maria, a much-needed morale boost at work. She mentioned him casually at first, stories of shared shifts and the challenges they faced. But Edward began noticing how often his name came up. One evening, Maria returned home late, her phone buzzing incessantly. Edward glanced at the screen and saw David's name flash across it. Something inside him tightened. "David seems to call you a lot," Edward said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the edge in his voice. Maria sighed, brushing off his concern. "We're just colleagues, Edward. He's new and still finding his footing. I'm helping him adjust." But Edward couldn't ignore the nagging doubt. Memories of Lisa's betrayal crept in, casting shadows on his thoughts. Was Maria pulling away from him too? Was he reading too much into her exhaustion in the messages? The strain between them reached a boiling point one night when Maria returned home later than usual. Edward, already on edge, confronted her as soon as she walked through the door. "Box. Do you ever plan to spend time here, Maria, or is the hospital your real home now?" he snapped. Maria, visibly tired, dropped her bag and turned to face him. "Edward, I'm doing the best I can. You know how demanding my job is." "Demanding or distracting?" Edward's voice rose, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Maria's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You tell me," Edward shot back. "Is David just a colleague, or is there more you're not telling me?" The room fell silent, tension thick between them. Maria's voice, when she finally spoke, was sharp. "I can't believe you'd say that. After everything we've been through, you still don't trust me." Martine muttered, "Sentimentalism," and looked at the other board members. Had all three been located, the messenger might all feel the same, or no. "It's not about trust," Edward replied, though even he didn't fully believe it. "It's about how distant you've become. I feel like I'm losing you, Maria." Her expression softened, but the hurt lingered. "I'm trying, Edward, but you need to stop comparing me to your past." Their argument ended in silence, neither willing to push further. But the distance between them grew heavier, the unspoken fears and doubts casting a long shadow over their relationship. Lance's black eyes met hers as her hand closed onto his. It began with a fever. At first, Edward thought it was just a cold. Children get sick, after all. But Annie's condition worsened rapidly, her energy fading, her once bright eyes dulling. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap. Severe kidney failure. The doctors were clear. Without a transplant, Annie's chances were slim. Edward's world shifted in an instant. Holding his daughter's tiny hand in the hospital room, he felt an overwhelming wave of helplessness and fear. Annie looked up at him, her voice weak. "Daddy, am I going to be okay?" "Gonna be just fine, sweetheart," Edward whispered, forcing a smile as tears burned his eyes. But inside, he was terrified. Edward threw himself into action. He underwent testing to see if he could be a donor, but the results crushed him. He wasn't a match. Desperate, he reached out to Maria, pleading for her support. He needed her strength, her medical knowledge, her presence. Annie needed her. But Maria's response wasn't what Edward had hoped for. "I'll do what I can," she said, her tone distant. She explained that David's son Liam had been admitted to the same hospital for a serious condition, and that she was helping David navigate the situation. "David," Edward said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Maria, this is Annie. She's fighting for her life. How can you prioritize anyone else?" Maria's face hardened. "It's not like that, Edward. I'm trying to help everyone. Liam doesn't have anyone else right now." Her words felt like a knife to Edward's heart. The woman he had relied on, trusted to be his partner in the hardest moments, seemed to be slipping away. As Maria spent more and more time at the hospital with David and his son, Edward found himself alone at Annie's bedside, watching her struggle to hold on to life. Edward's nights became a blur of anguish and sleeplessness. He stayed by Annie's side, holding her close, wiping her forehead during fevered nights, and reading her favorite stories to distract her from the pain. Each passing day made his desperation grow. One evening, as Maria returned home late again, Edward finally confronted her, his voice breaking with anger and despair. "How can you leave us like this, Maria? How can you abandon Annie when she needs you most?" Maria's eyes filled with guilt, but her response was calm. "I'm doing the best I can, Edward. I'm stretched thin. This isn't fair to put all on me." "Fair?" Edward spat, his voice rising. "Annie is our daughter. She's fighting for her life and you're off playing hero for someone else. I'm here, alone, trying to keep it together for her, and you're not even trying to help." Maria's silence spoke louder than any defense she could offer. Edward turned away, his shoulders slumped, under the weight of the burden he bore alone. In that moment, Edward realized something painful but true. He couldn't count on Maria anymore. Annie's survival depended on him, and him alone. Determined, he resolved to fight for his daughter with everything he had, even if it meant doing it without Maria by his side. Edward's suspicions about Maria had grown over time, fueled by her constant absences and increasingly defensive behavior. But the truth came to light in the most unexpected way. Late one night, while sorting through bills, Edward noticed discrepancies in their joint account. Withdrawals for significant sums had been made without his knowledge, funds earmarked for Annie's medical expenses. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but further investigation revealed the shocking truth. Maria had been transferring money to an account linked to David. Digging deeper, Edward uncovered hotel receipts and cryptic messages on Maria's phone. Her affair with David wasn't just emotional. It had crossed into betrayal of the family's trust, both emotionally and financially. The final piece fell into place when he found an email exchange between Maria and David discussing plans to leave town together. The weight of her actions hit Edward like a tidal wave. Maria hadn't just betrayed their relationship. She had jeopardized Annie's future. Edward felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. His hands shook as he stared at the evidence, his mind racing between disbelief and fury. He had trusted Maria, led her into the most vulnerable corners of his life, and she had not only failed him, but also betrayed their daughter. That night, as he sat alone at the kitchen table, the weight of everything bore down on him. Yet, Amidst the anger and heartbreak, a single thought crystallized. He would not allow Maria's actions to hurt Annie any further. Edward's resolve hardened. The next morning, he contacted a lawyer to initiate legal steps to secure full custody of Annie and separate Maria from their finances. He also informed the hospital's HR department about Maria's misuse of funds, ensuring there would be consequences for her actions. For Annie's sake, Edward vowed to stay strong. Maria's betrayal might have shaken him, but it wouldn't break him. His focus was clear: protecting his daughter and rebuilding a life where she could thrive, free from the shadows of deceit. Edward waited until Maria returned home late one evening, her usual calm demeanor masking the storm she didn't see coming. As she walked in, he placed the printed receipts, bank statements, and text screenshots on the table between them. "What's this?" Maria asked, her voice faltering as she glanced at the documents. "You tell me," Edward replied coldly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Hotel stays, money transfers, texts with David. How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been stealing from our family?" Maria's expression shifted, a mix of guilt and defiance. "You don't understand," she started, her voice low. She went on in a low voice. "I understand perfectly," Edward snapped, cutting her off. "You betrayed me, and worse, you put Annie's life at risk for your selfish games." Maria took a step back, her mask of calm cracking. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said, her voice shaking. Edward's voice was like ice. "It's already too far. You're done here." Instead of remorse, Maria's response was chilling. "If Annie needs my kidney," she said, her tone suddenly cold, "then I want $20 million in exchange." Edward froze, stunned by the sheer cruelty of her demand. "Are you even hearing yourself?" he asked, his voice rising. "That's your daughter. How could you put a price on her life?" Maria crossed her arms, her face void of emotion. "This is my offer. Take it or leave it." Edward's stomach turned. The woman he had once admired and trusted had become unrecognizable, consumed by greed and selfishness. Edward stood tall, his voice steady and resolute. "You've already lost your family, Maria, but you'll never touch Annie's life again." He walked away, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. He contacted his lawyer the next day, ensuring Maria would have no legal claim over their daughter. For Edward, the chapter with Maria was over. A painful but necessary end to protect the only thing that truly mattered: Annie's future.